They slid a hospital band over my hand. The nurse leaned in, wintergreen breath, lips barely moving. "Don't sign anything." "Not tonight." She pressed her thumb inside the band. Ink bled one word only I could see: run. People like me get called ma'am and handed brochures about hydration. People like me don't get warnings written on plastic. I drove home anyway. Pride is an old habit. The porch light didn't come on. It always comes on. I stared at the blue-veined back of my own hand, at the raised white letters of Ruth Whittaker, female 68 Bayview General, and felt all the air leave my chest. I told them I was fine. I told the doctor my dizzy spell had passed, and the black isn't black anymore, just a gray fringe if I stand up too fast. He nodded in pleasant circles and sent me off with a neat packet about hydration, as if water could fix the feeling I had when the nurse's eyes skittered to the door. On my way out, I turned my wrist so nobody else would see the ink. The fluorescent lights clicked like a second hand. The sliding doors breathed out cold night, and the smell of rain met me like an old friend with bad news. I shouldn't have driven. That's what they say after an accident, and I could hear Caleb's voice in my head already, that particular worried tone my son uses when he's arranging me. But the ride home is 9 minutes if the light at Alder holds green, and pride is an old habit. The plastic wristband scratched my skin as I angled the turn signal, and in the glow from the dash, I turned it again to be sure I hadn't imagined it. Run. The ink had smudged a little. Not enough to make it a different word. Bayview at night is wet cedar. Diner neon reflecting in puddles, gulls fussing even when the coast is miles away. I turned down our street and let the tires kiss the ruts I knew by muscle memory. It occurs to me now that memory is a map we don't know we're holding until someone tries to fold it up. The porch light didn't come on. It always comes on. The bulb had burned out, of course, and I told myself not to make it a symbol as I found the cool mouth of the spare key under the fake rabbit by the step. The living room was warm and wrong the way a room is after someone moves the picture frames half an inch. My husband laughed from a photograph on the mantel and didn't know it wasn't funny anymore. There were papers on the coffee table, thin, official things, and then they were not on the table because the sound of the lock made them fly. A whisper, a footstep. The kitchen fan made its low twirl that never matches the speed of your thoughts. Caleb? The name was a reflex. Mothers are stitched to them. No answer. Just the hum of a refrigerator and the minus signs of two people holding their breath. Our old doors never close all the way. That's the sort of honesty a house gives you if you live in it long enough. I stood where the hallway floor doesn't creak and watched the slice of light under the guest room door. It's not really a guest room. It's the room where coats go when closets give up, the room with the extra bed that thinks it's a sofa. The inside voices were careful, the way people talk when they believe the person at the center of the conversation has become an object on a checklist. "It'll be fine if the letter's clean," a man's voice said, Caleb's voice, my boy dressed in someone else's reasoning. "The judge signs by Monday." 2 signatures, maybe 3, and it's done. A woman answered. Megan, Caleb's wife, the girl who never stopped being 30 in her own head. "We should have done this months ago, after that stove thing. She never remembers to turn it off. It's not safe, the stove." I turned and saw the dial I had touched an hour ago. Off, straight as noon. A third voice I recognized from church, a man with prayer woven into his hair. "Keep your voices down," Elder Knox said, that tone he uses for people in microphones. "This is what emergency guardianship is for." The hearing's quick when there's a safety concern. She'll be better in a memory care setting. Everyone sleeps better. We can help her sign the house into trust so she's protected. It's in her best interest. Best interest tastes like aluminum in the mouth. I had learned those words 40 years ago at a juvenile court clerk's desk, pulling files and learning the alphabet of how adults locate their conscience on official paper. Emergency, ex parte, best interest. If you arrange them right, you can do just about anything to somebody and call it a kindness. I set my purse down the way you set down a fragile lie and walked backward into my own bedroom as if anyone looking would see I was moving in reverse, which is indeed what I was doing. My wristband tugged again, the inside secret pressing the skin. Run. It's funny what you decide to take when you don't know what you're leaving. There's the list you make in your head. Passport, cash envelope, the small notebook with handwriting too small for anyone but me, the safe deposit key on a ribbon inside the sewing box. And then there's the thing your hand reaches for without permission. Mine closed over the walnut gavel on my dresser, the one I carved when my hands were steadier. Names carried jokes around with them, and mine had been the butt of a good one for years. Grandma's gavel, they'd say. Isn't she cute? And I'd play along and strike it on the table when a grandchild yelled at a cookie. I didn't think I'd need it for my own life. I moved through the house the way you walk in a chapel, careful not to make a ritual out of it. Shoes, coat, a scarf, the envelope of cash my husband had insisted we keep for the feeling of it. Humans like to know they can hold their choices. I put the notebook into the inside pocket of the coat and felt its familiar square against my ribs. On the corner of my vanity, under the little blue glass dish for rings, the safe deposit key glinted the way small things do when they suspect they're about to matter. On the kitchen table, under a coaster, the letter opener lay like a tiny sword in a story that had too many real swords already. I left it and wrote on a piece of yellow paper with my thinnest pen, went to get milk. The most ordinary lie the world has. My handwriting betrayed me with its neatness, the kind of tidy that makes people think you are fine. I set the paper where Caleb would see it and let myself out through the mudroom door, the door that always sticks if you treat it like a stranger and slides if you talk to it first. The Bayview Motel smells like lemon and cigarettes because people wash things and then burn them. The night clerk had baby cheeks and the bored look of someone pretending he didn't see the wristband when he slid a key across the counter without the weight of questions. I had $9 in change from the hospital cafeteria apple that tasted like a refrigerator. I turned the TV on for alibi noise and sat on the edge of the bed and touched the word on my wrist until the ink blotted my skin. I have a list of numbers in my head from the years when we wrote them on paper because we didn't trust machines to remember them for us. I dialed the first one, and when a man answered with a familiar patience that sounds like experience, I felt the floor under me at least be a floor. Anthony Delgado, he said, and all the attention in his voice was for the person on the other end. Ruth Whitaker, I said. You still remember me at this hour? He laughed in the middle of a sigh, a noise for people who know what's coming and can't stop it. I remember the people who returned calls. Tell me what's happened. And so I did the triage version at first, like a list of symptoms. He asked the next questions people ask. Who has your mail? Do they have any papers with your signature? Where is your money? What did the nurse say? And then he said something so simple it should have been obvious. You have to stay somewhere they won't come looking first. I told him about the motel, and he said it was good except that it wasn't and we'd change it in the morning. I dialed Lydia next. When you've lived in a town long enough, the reporters know who the clerks are because the clerks know where the stories file themselves. I thought you retired into your garden, she said after hello, and I told her the garden was exactly as tidy as things on the surface usually are. Lydia is the kind of woman whose Rolodex is wider than the ocean and more accurate than it has any right to be. If someone is greasing the skids on a guardianship, we'll see the footprints, she said, and I was grateful for the pronoun we. At 8:59 in the morning, I was a polite woman wearing a raincoat and turning a plastic wristband inside out. At 9:01, I was a problem. The bank had polished floors and the same women behind the counter who'd been behind the counter when my hair was still more brown than silver. The manager came out from her glass office when she saw me and smiled the way people smile at you when they're trying hard to be on your side without knowing which side there is. Ms. Whitaker, she said, your son stopped by. Said there was a medical situation and he needed temporary access to your accounts. We explained the policy. Without a court order or a power of attorney on file, we can't. The way she said can't had muscle in it. I wondered if he had pushed. He insisted, she said quietly. We asked him to leave. They always try the bank first, Anthony would say later, because money is faster than custody. I moved from the checking window to the safe deposit room, where the small key on the ribbon started to feel like it had waited its whole life for this day. The box weighed too much for its size, which is how you know paper matters. Inside, under a plastic bag with a photograph of my husband in a plaid shirt holding a trout, was the ledger he'd kept when he was city auditor. It's a funny thing, a ledger. Numbers pretending they don't tell stories. Names, dates, dollar amounts. A round number here, a rounder one there, checks to foundations and community funds that smelled faintly like favors. Back when my husband was alive, he had tried to show these pages to the right person. People change shape when you ask them to see the wrong thing. He died driving home from work on a clear day, when nothing fell from the sky and no one was drunk. I kept the ledger the way widows keep jokes alive without telling them. Under the ledger lay a single folded deed to a timber parcel that looks on a map like a crooked finger pointing nowhere. It was the sort of patch of land you carry in a drawer because you promised someone you'd tuck it away and think about it after Christmas. Last fall, I had seen surveyors in orange vests on the road up toward the ridge and thought, well, that's interesting. And then made a pie because pies are honest work. If someone else had noticed that deed in my files, someone might have thought I was worth moving like a pawn on a small town board. Anthony looked at the deed like it had said a curse word. Bayview Community Trust, he murmured, which is how you say something neutral with all the history of your throat. They've been acquiring parcels for years. Good projects, mostly. Sometimes good deeds get done by people who like to see their names on buildings. Sometimes it's just land that wants to be a golf course. Lydia had the patience to wait until he finished, then said the thing that made my stomach feel like glass. We need 3 things by tonight, she said. Proof of coercion, proof of forgery, and one public moment they can't spin. I told them I had ears that had heard my son and his wife and a church elder in my hallway planning my best interest. I told them my nurse had written "run" on my wristband and whispered in the ER. Find me the nurse, I said. If she's brave once, she might be brave twice. Lydia stepped into the hallway to make calls that sounded like gossip and functioned like a scalpel. We pulled bait the way you pull a splinter. Careful, steady, ready to hurt. Facebook is the town square we think is a living room, and by noon there was a post with a photograph of a table full of knickknacks and the words, estate sale, cash only, rain or shine. I put out sensible things I didn't mind losing and hid 2 cameras, one in an old clock and one in a cookie tin with flour dust in its seams. We put the address as my house. Anthony was nervous and Lydia looked delighted. I sat across the street in a borrowed Subaru that smelled like oranges and waited to see whether the people who loved me would show up to steal me. They did. That's the short version. The long one involves Megan's voice pitched too bright the way some women sharpen a smile when they feel watched. Take the jewelry first, she said. Mom's not sentimental. Caleb's voice was lower, hands in pockets even when he wasn't standing in a photograph. We need signatures, he answered, which is what people say when they want to pretend a signature is the same as consent. Elder Knox's shoulders filled my doorway as if God himself had set him to block out the sun, and he had taken the assignment literally. She's not here, he said, and they moved through my home like practical thieves. When you are recording a crime committed by people you have fed and forgiven, your heart makes a strange, small sound. I have known cruelty in the world in the way everyone has, but this particular variety is a more domestic poison. I watched my daughter-in-law slide my wedding band onto her finger and make a face at her own reflection that said she was going to text a friend about it later. I watched my son open the drawer where my husband's military discharge papers live and close it again without a thought, because even thieves have a narrative of decency they require of themselves. The cookie tin recorded it all, and Lydia breathed evenly, like she was keeping the air in the car from escaping. I thought of calling the police. Anthony shook his head and put his hand on my knee like an anchor. "Not yet," he said. "Let them speak more." And he was right, because people condemn themselves with their own sentences when they think the ceiling is listening only to prayer. When the nurse called, she used a payphone and sounded like whispering without the whisper. "You don't know me," she said, and then confessed. "I'm the one who wrote on your band." They told me to find a doctor who would sign capacity without an exam. I wouldn't. I wrote the warning. I shouldn't be on the line this long. The corner of my mouth might have lifted when I asked her name, because somewhere under the danger of it all was the human need to say thank you properly. She paused and then said, "Priya. Priya Narang." Her voice trembled on the R. "They tried to push it through last night," she said. "The clinic administrator, Dahl, rushed a template. I printed it, and I couldn't give it to the ER doc with a clean face. I told him to go home and sleep and said I'd get it to him in the morning. I asked her why me, and she told me about an anonymous caller who had pinged my chart twice with concerns. They said you wander," she whispered. "They said you leave the stove on. They said you forget people's names. I've seen your chart. You had a dizzy spell because you didn't drink water like a normal human in winter. You're not who they say I told her I would stand beside her if she wanted to make this public. She told me she would testify, but not yet. She couldn't. Her mother was in an apartment above the strip mall, and the administrator could make her life small with 2 calls. We surfaced together," I said, and heard the word together do its work in her chest. By noon the next day, the town's title company lobby hummed with people trying to look like they hadn't arranged their lunch breaks to include drama. Lydia said there was a closing on a parcel whose description matched my deed, and when I stepped inside and saw the sign-in sheet say Bayview Community Trust on one line and Whitaker Family Trust on another, the skin on my arms prickled as if somebody had turned the thermostat down. The receptionist, a woman with soft hair who had been in my book club until everyone pretended they didn't like mysteries anymore, looked up at me and rearranged her face into a different version of polite. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to observe a fraud," I answered, and the sentence hung in the air like a misplaced hymn. Caleb walked in with Megan on his arm and 3 kinds of clothing choices that said he was trying to look both casual and important. Megan's smile was wide enough to be a dare. Elder Knox trailed behind them like an exclamation point. "Mom," Caleb said, and the word did a violence inside me I did not appreciate. "There you are." "We were just," Megan started to say, and I cut the sentence in half. "Selling land you don't own," I said, and my own voice was calm, in that way voices get when they are tired of crying. Anthony stepped through the door the way lawyers do when they know the timelines better than the clocks on the wall. "Injunction," he said quietly to the woman at the desk. And for all that, lawyers are accused of drama. The way the file folder slid across the counter made less noise than a page turning. I could feel eyes on us, the way a town stares when it thinks it might get a story to tell at dinner. Lydia lifted her phone because when justice finally puts on her shoes, she expects to be filmed. "Ms. Whitaker's interests have been misrepresented in a trust document," Anthony said in the measured voice that wins arguments by not being contagious. "We request that any closing be paused until the court can hear evidence of forgery." The title officer, a man with a tie that was almost a joke, cleared his throat and said the words any decent company should. "We don't close contested property." Elder Knox opened his mouth to say something about safety and Ruth's best interest and a plan that would ensure her care, and I felt something old in me resist the use of my name like a tool. "Don't you use that word like a shield," I told him. "Best." The room made a sound I wish I could describe. It's the sound a community makes when it suspects it is implicated. It's not quite a gasp. It's more like a hush that has opinions. In that hush, the door opened again and Priya walked in and made her fear stand up straight. I was asked to procure a doctor's letter attesting to incapacity without examination, she said in a voice that was louder than you'd expect from a person her size. I refused. I wrote on her wristband instead. She held up a photograph she'd taken of my ban from the paperwork she'd filed to cover herself, and there was the pen mark, small and insistent. People who consider themselves practical have a hard time with heroism when it wears scrubs. If this were a different kind of story, someone might have apologized. No one did. Knox's mouth tightened into piety. Megan's face flushed a beautiful, ugly color. Caleb looked for a door where there was only a wall. Lydia turned directly to the people in the chairs and said what she does best. "Here's the thing about guardianship," she said conversationally, like she was asking for another cup of coffee. "It's supposed to protect people who can't protect themselves. It's supposed to be careful. It's supposed to be watched. When it's rushed, when professionals cut corners, when signatures move faster than the truth, bad things happen. People lose their homes to their children and think it's for their safety because someone told them a story and called it law." She gestured toward Priya like a stage manager cueing the hero. "And then a nurse with a conscience decides she won't be part of it." I wish I could say the title officer slapped the file closed dramatically. He didn't. He did something better. He said, "We're done here," in a tone that could build a building, and the room exhaled what it had been holding. Knox tried to gather everyone with the word misunderstanding, which is the cousin of best interest that shows up when people are embarrassed. Anthony placed a court reporter's card on the counter because you should always leave a trail of paper when you leave a trail of truth. That night, I stared at the gavel on my dresser until the wood took on the memory of my hands. I thought about how my life looked from the street, a widow who took good care of her shrubs and talked too long to people in the cereal aisle, and how easily a fragile version of me could be fabricated on forms I'd never see. It is possible to build a cardboard person. It is also possible to say no. Court smells like old books and patience. The benches have more history than anybody sitting on them. When the judge called the case, his tone said he had heard this story before and was going to listen to it again without deciding the ending early. The prosecutor moved like something fluid and orderly. He asked me when I first suspected my family intended to petition, and I told him the exact time by the clock in the hallway because I have the civilian superpower of telling time, the way most people can identify their own car in a parking lot. He asked me who warned me. I said her name, Priya. He asked me what I found in my safe deposit box. I told him about the ledger and the way numbers confess if you hold them long enough. They played the audio from the cookie tin. There is nothing quite like hearing your son on a recording say the words "switch her meds" and she won't notice. Jurors are not supposed to react. They always do with their eyebrows. The defense tried to explain the statement as a worry about my blood pressure, as an offhand comment as frustration. People who haven't raised children don't know how many ways a mother can read her child's voice. I heard fatigue. I heard calculation. I heard a boy who used to lay his head in my lap because he had cut his knee on the driveway and wanted to be told he was brave. Love is a stubborn archivist. It remembers the early drafts of us. Priya told the truth under oath, with the simple sightline of someone who decided to. She made Doll look smaller without using adjectives. The prosecutor asked her why she wrote on my wristband. She said she didn't want to be the kind of nurse who delivered a form like a bullet. The administrator, light in the face like people get when they're caught in their own conveniences, tried to land on a prepositional phrase about backlog and templates and staff shortages. The judge lifted a hand a fraction of an inch, and the sentence died like it had never been born. Lydia sat in the gallery with a notebook, but looked like a woman trying to remember every face. When the ledger came out, the room shuffled in its seats. My late husband had written the way he lived: square letters, careful numbers, a note in the margin if something stuck in his craw. The prosecutor pointed to a string of checks that arced from a community trust to a consulting firm to a relative of Knox's. And if you want to know how a town chokes, watch a church elder read his own name in a story that isn't a psalm. The trust document with my forged signature made its entrance next. My signature has always bitten down hard on the T in my last name as if to anchor the end of me. The forgery floated. My neighbor in the third row let out the smallest O. I don't know what I expected to feel when the verdict landed. Relief is a blunt instrument. The jury took less time than anyone predicted because sometimes right slides into place like a drawer. The judge said words I can repeat only in paraphrase, because what I heard through the filter of my own relief were not the syllables, but the shape of them. Attempted fraud, forgery, conspiracy to abuse guardianship. The sentences were numbers on a line. Mercy was its own math, and I have my opinions about whether we add well when the ledger is emotional instead of fiscal. Caleb stared at the table like it had been painted with a view to the future. Megan cried a shape that didn't look like grief so much as inconvenience. Knox's posture shrank one vertebra at a time. Dahl requested another chance at an unblemished career. Priya walked out beside me and stood in the hallway, like someone who had done a thing too big to fit inside her and was adjusting to it. I told the truth to a reporter on my porch the next week because the light was good and Lydia never asks a question to hear herself. I told her the part about run on the wristband because symbols need to be put to work. I told her how people use safety to set fire to other people's agency. I said my son's name and didn't apologize for saying it. I have been told my whole life to protect the men around me from consequence. I declined the assignment. The timber parcel sold later that spring to a couple who wanted trees instead of a lawn. We did the paperwork properly. The title company printed my name and had me sign in blue ink so I could tell later I had signed the original. Lydia stood beside me and took a picture of the room, not me because she's sentimental about process. Anthony's invoice was neat and fair, and because the human soul needs projects to go along with grievances, I took part of the money and made a fund with a name that had been a joke and felt properly heavier now. Grandma's gavel pays for 3 things: a second opinion before anyone signs a capacity letter for a person whose only diagnosis is being old in a country that worships busy, a decent lawyer for people who raise decent people who turned out not to be, and a set of microphones, literal and metaphorical, so those people can say on porches and in church basements and town halls that their lives are not paper shapes to be filed. I kept the house because you keep the house if it keeps you. The azaleas did better this year than last because I learned not to overwater. There's a joke there somewhere about hydration and dizzy spells, and anyone who hears it can make of it what they want. I sanded the gavel and rubbed oil into the walnut, and when I struck it on the table, it made a sound like yes. Caleb wrote me letters from the place where consequences go to make men practice their apologies. Some days I held the envelopes. Some days I put them in the drawer where unasked questions nap. Megan sent 2 emails and then decided I didn't exist, like people filing for their own oblivion. Knox resigned from something in a newsletter article that used words like stepping back to spend time with family. Dahl took a job 1 town over where the administrators have maybe figured out that people who run clinics should be the people who care whether humans get treated like humans. Priya came over on a Sunday with muffins. She said she hadn't baked, but had arranged on a plate with seriousness. She told me her mother's knees hurt and that her boss had a new boss and that sometimes she wakes up remembering the minute she wrote run and thinks she was reckless. I told her recklessness is a moral category invented by comfortable people. I said I was grateful she had chosen to be uncomfortable. She cried into a paper napkin the way nurses cry, efficiently, kindly, to make room for the next thing that will need their tears. I don't know what I expected to feel when the verdict landed. Relief is a blunt instrument. The jury took less time than anyone predicted because sometimes right slides into place like a drawer. The judge said words I can repeat only in paraphrase because what I heard through the filter of my own relief were not the syllables, but the shape of them. Attempted fraud, forgery, conspiracy to abuse guardianship. The sentences were numbers on a line. Mercy was its own math, and I have my opinions about whether we add well when the ledger is emotional instead of fiscal. Caleb stared at the table like it had been painted with a view to the future. Megan cried a shape that didn't look like grief so much as inconvenience. Knox's posture shrank one vertebra at a time. Doll requested another chance at an unblemished career. Priya walked out beside me and stood in the hallway like someone who had done a thing too big to fit inside her and was adjusting to it. I told the truth to a reporter on my porch the next week because the light was good and Lydia never asks a question to hear herself. I told her the part about run on the wristband because symbols need to be put to work. I told her how people use safety to set fire to other people's agency. I said my son's name and didn't apologize for saying it. I have been told my whole life to protect the men around me from consequence. I declined the assignment. The timber parcel sold later that spring to a couple who wanted trees instead of a lawn. We did the paperwork properly. The title company printed my name and had me sign in blue ink so I could tell later I had signed the original. Lydia stood beside me and took a picture of the room. Not me, because she's sentimental about process. Anthony's invoice was neat and fair, and because the human soul needs projects to go along with grievances, I took part of the money and made a fund with a name that had been a joke and felt properly heavier now. Grandma's gavel pays for 3 things: a second opinion before anyone signs a capacity letter for a person whose only diagnosis is being old in a country that worships busy, a decent lawyer for people who raise decent people who turned out not to be, and a set of microphones, literal and metaphorical, so those people can say on porches and in church basements and town halls that their lives are not paper shapes to be filed. I kept the house because you keep the house if it keeps you. The azaleas did better this year than last because I learned not to overwater. There's a joke there somewhere about hydration and dizzy spells, and anyone who hears it can make of it what they want. I sanded the gavel and rubbed oil into the walnut, and when I struck it on the table, it made a sound like yes. Caleb wrote me letters from the place where consequences go to make men practice their apologies. Some days I held the envelopes, some days I put them in the drawer where unasked questions nap. Megan sent 2 emails and then decided I didn't exist like people filing for their own oblivion. Knox resigned from something in a newsletter article that used words like stepping back to spend time with family. Doll took a job one town over where the administrators have maybe figured out that people who run clinics should be the people who care, whether humans get treated like humans. Priya came over on a Sunday with muffins. She said she hadn't baked, but had arranged on a plate with seriousness. She told me her mother's knees hurt and that her boss had a new boss, and that sometimes she wakes up remembering the minute she wrote run and thinks she was reckless. I told her recklessness is a moral category invented by comfortable people. I said I was grateful she had chosen to be uncomfortable. She cried into a paper napkin the way nurses cry, efficiently, kindly, to make room for the next thing that will need their tears. Lydia stood on my porch when the light was right and asked me if I was ready to go on record in a way that lived longer than our town. I said I already had, with my life. She nodded and closed her notebook, not because she was done, but because she is a person who knows a period when she hears one. We sat in 2 chairs my husband had built and listened to the evening make all those small noises towns make when the weather is deciding what to do. If you think you could never miss the feeling of your son as a small, warm person asleep against your chest, you haven't lived long enough. I miss that child. I do not miss the adult who chose a path where his mother's agency was a thing to move out of the way. Loving someone does not mean letting them revise you into a more convenient version of yourself. I learned that late. I'm lucky to have learned it at all. When the first woman I didn't know knocked on my door and asked if I might sit with her a while because her daughter had taken her mail and said it was for safety, I made tea and we sat. When the second woman came, I realized I needed more chairs. Now some afternoons, my living room fills with a choir of soft, furious voices. We compare notes. We read the small print aloud. We practice sentences like, I am not signing that today and thank you for your concern. I will be talking to my attorney before I make any decisions about my capacity. Then we talk about bird feeders or recipes, or how to get mildew off a flagstone walk because a person is not a problem to be solved. A person is a person. You could say the moral of this story is don't trust your children. But that's just another way to write us small. The moral is don't be made of paper if you can help it. Don't let your name be a thing someone else fills in on a line. Learn the shape of your signature, so if it floats, you'll know it isn't yours. Keep a ledger in your heart, not the kind with numbers, but the kind with promises, and write in it in the square. Neat hand your mother taught you when she said, if you are going to put your name on something, do not be ashamed of the lines. I go to the courthouse sometimes now, not because I have business there anymore, but because the benches still hold. I like to watch the faces of people at the beginning of their own stories and hope the words they hear next come from people who understand the difference between helping and taking over. Some mornings I put my gavel in my bag, a little private joke, and sit where the light hits the floor in a long, serious stripe. If a stranger sits beside me, I ask them how they are and mean it. If they say fine, I wait a beat and ask again. People will tell you the truth if you offer them a place to set it down. I keep the wristband in a drawer under my socks. The ink has faded to the color of a bruise that's almost gone. Run, it says, faint as a whisper. I don't run much anymore. My knees have their opinions, and I respect the territory. But I move. I move toward the things that need me, and away from the ones that don't. When I tell this story, people ask me what I'd say if I could speak to the nurse again for the first time. I say I would thank her, and then I would tell her the truth I didn't know that night in the ER. Sometimes you don't run away. Sometimes you run toward a better version of your own life and call it what it is. The night the verdict came in, I slept for 11 hours and dreamed nothing. The next morning, the cedar smell was new instead of old. The porch steps needed painting, and I made a list. The azaleas wanted pruning, and I Googled something and then called my neighbor anyway, because the internet is a lonely kind of knowledge. I made toast and didn't burn it. I wrote a check to Grandma's gavel and then set up the automatic thing on the computer, which felt like sorcery until I remembered sorcery is what you call competence when you've been told you can't learn it. Caleb will always be my son, the way the sea is always there whether you can smell it from your yard or not. Being related is not the same as being family. Family is a promise you keep and keep and keep. And if you break it, the person you broke it to is allowed to decide whether to let you build it again. I do not know if we will build anything. I do know that when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who learned to tell the difference between a signature and consent, between being safe and being silenced, between a wristband and her own arm. When I'm asked, as I am more often now, to speak somewhere about elder justice, I begin with my name because names matter. I say I am Ruth Whitaker, and I live in Bayview, Oregon, where it rains more than it doesn't, and people pretend they aren't watching you even when they are. I say someone wrote "run" on my wristband and saved me from a paper version of myself. I say there are good people everywhere, and the bad ones are not clever so much as consistent. I say the systems we build can be used to save or to steal. The difference is not just policy, but people. I say the reason I'm telling you this is because someone is going to ask you to sign something someday, and you might want to be the sort of person who turns the wristband over before you pick up the pen. On my kitchen table, beside the salt, there is a small square of walnut, polished from hands. Sometimes I touch it in the morning before I start the day, not like a weapon, but like a bell. A gavel is supposed to make a sound the room agrees to hear. When I strike it gently, a soft thud claims the air between me and whatever comes next. It is not a threat. It is an announcement. I am here. I am whole. I will be deciding my life along with you, not in spite of you, not under you, not above you, but with my own name on the line in the shape I made with my own hand. The nurse who wrote on my wristband comes to dinner once a month now. We talk about her mother and my garden and what it means to refuse a template. The reporter brings dessert and occasionally a bottle of something we drink in careful portions because we are not 25 and never did care for headaches. The attorney sends articles he thinks we'll like, and sometimes he shows up in person with a smile that looks like a man who has watched a different ending enough times to be grateful for this one. We disagree about small things because that's what people who trust each other do. When the conversation runs low, I look at the women at my table and think the word together again in my chest. I don't sign things quickly now. I don't say yes to sentences I didn't write. I don't put my head down when someone says best interest and expects my silence to do the rest. If this makes me stubborn, then at least I have company. The women in my living room, the nurse with her steady hands, the reporter with her neat notes, the lawyer with his quiet folder. This is the family I chose, and it turns out choice is one of the few things that holds. The azaleas bloom and then don't and then bloom again. The porch paint chips and then shines. The rain comes like a truth you can't argue with, and when it stops, the air tastes like a beginning. If you are listening to this with your hands folded, thinking the story belongs to someone else, here is the part where I say, the thing I wish someone had said to me before the night a stranger wrote on my skin. You are not paperwork. You are not a line where someone else puts their handwriting to make their day easier. You are not a list of symptoms or a collection of convenient errors. If someone tells you your capacity is a problem because it's inconvenient for them, turn your wrist over. Look for the ink the people who care about you left for you when you weren't looking. If you don't see it, imagine it. Run, it says, not away from the world, toward yourself. I place the gavel back on the dresser when I'm done with it because tools should be where you can find them. The mirror over the dresser is the same one we bought when we were 27, the glass a little fogged at the corners, which is either a metaphor or just something old. I lean close and watch my breath mark it and fade. I practice my name with my finger on the surface, not to sign anything, just to remember the curve of the letters. Then I turn off the light and go make a list of groceries and call a friend and check the weather because I am a person, not a case. And the future should have ordinary things in it alongside the brave ones. On the day the first check from Grandma's gavel went out, I walked to the mailbox with a satisfaction I have rarely known. The envelope was addressed to a woman in a town I've never been to, whose daughter had convinced her physician to say she was slipping, whose pastor had told her to accept God's will for her independence, whose banker had looked unimpressed when she banged on the counter with the flat of her palm. The money paid for a second opinion from a psychiatrist who thinks the elderly are adults. The second opinion said the thing the first one should have. I imagine her wrist as she turned over the plastic band after her own ER visit. I imagine her smile when the pen told her something true. If you knocked on my door right now, you would find me in the kitchen wearing shoes that make sense and a sweater my granddaughter left behind 2 Christmases ago. I would offer you tea or coffee or the polite American version of neither, which is a glass of water with ice. I would ask you about your day and mean it. I would listen to your answer and not correct your verbs. I would tell you a story that is mine, and then I would ask you for one of yours. This is how we fix it, I think. Not with grand policies I can't pass alone, but with porches and questions and the insistence on seeing each other as people and not convenient characters in somebody else's paperwork. I keep the letter opener on the table now where I can see it. It has the shape of a tiny sword in a story with enough giant ones. I use it to open mail I want and mail I don't. I use it to slice open catalogs filled with things I don't need and hospital envelopes with polite lies. I use it to remind myself that sometimes the sharp thing on your table is just a tool for opening things instead of a weapon. I like that distinction. It leaves me room to live. If you have gotten this far, you might want an ending where everyone says they're sorry and means it. I do not have that. I have something else. I have mornings that begin in a house I kept with a name that I write myself. I have a nurse who chose the right fear. I have a reporter who knows how to keep a story from wandering off. I have a lawyer who believes the law is still a place where people can be protected if you walk in early enough with the right folder. I have a ledger in a box that is now just a history lesson instead of a threat. I have a son who may someday figure out how to become the boy who used to lay his head in my lap when he was sad. That is not today's problem, and that is a freedom. I am Ruth. That is my signature. It bites down hard on the T, not because I am angry, but because I like my letters to hold. If you ever see it floating somewhere it shouldn't be, do me a favor and strike the gavel once in your kitchen. Let the sound say what it says in my house when I use it. Enough. And also, here. And also, mine.